Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to Anne Lister in the Garden. Thanks so much to the Anne Lister Research Summit team for having us here. I'm super excited to be here. So I'm Sue Moss. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement for the Royal Horticultural Society most of the time, and in my other time, I'm a researcher in the history of plants and gardens. Today, I am also joined by the very fabulous Lynn Shawls, who I know many of you know as part of the Summit team. So Lynn is one of the transcribers of Anne's diaries from the West Yorkshire Archive Service project, and has published articles on Anne on both Packed with Potential and In Search of Anne Walker. So you're in very safe hands with Lynn, even if not with me. So I really am delighted to be here. I've enjoyed lots of the sessions so far. So thank you to people who have given those. I'm so excited to be involved. When Gentleman Jack first came on the telly in 2019 and we all got into Anne Lister, I was so excited by what we might find in the diaries about sort of botanical insight in that time, and got some really interesting insight into that from Anne Schomer, but then, life got in the way. So I was really excited this year when Lynn got in touch and suggested that she'd got some insight from the diaries and that we could work together on this. So very excited. So where we go next? Today, we're going to look at some of the scientific context around this time and looking at the history of botany and a bit of science, just to see the situation that Anne was operating within. We're also going to look at some awesome historical female figures, so female scientists and the people that Anne was working alongside. And then Lynn is going to look at some of Anne's plant and garden endeavours. So where were we on the science at this time? So looking from sort of 1700 to 1800, the 17th century was a time when we had Francis Bacon, we had John Locke, we had Isaac Newton. Science really kind of kicked off and away from the general religious thoughts of nature and how that happened. In the 18th century, this became much more popular. So there were lots of discoveries in the 18th century, things like the first method of storing electricity. Linnaeus came up with his Systema Naturae and found a way of ordering the world that people many people subscribed to in a way that they hadn't with the system before. Lots of plants like the foxglove came to light as being very useful in medicine. Cuvier established distinction as fact in 1796. The smallpox vaccination was developed by sort of by Jenner. It was really by a lady before him, just before 1800. And then we get the battery, we get the cell nucleus discovered. And in the 19th century, when Anne really started to operate, we start to get into real understandings of things like evolution and a much more professionalization of science, where before it was kind of just done by anyone who fancied doing it in their kitchen, really. Science was also popular at this time. So the 18th century really was about science coming into that popular consciousness, and men and women alike were kind of constructing identities for themselves based on their pursuit of knowledge. And it broke down social barriers as well, as knowledge was transferred from professionals who benefited from the money and the land of elites. And the elites benefited from the validation of ideas from professionals. And I think we see that a little bit with Anne, who was kind of allying herself with some of those professional scientists of the day who she was learning from. So botany was accessible science even to women. So lots of other forms of science required big equipment, or it required chemicals, things if you're doing physics, things like air pumps. Whereas plants and botany, they were everywhere if you wanted particularly the common plants, and botany became a very equitable area in which people could operate together. It was also a really big business. So from a gardens and estates point of view, landowners were improving their estates into vast gardens. They were filling them with plants coming to Britain from all over the world, often in quite problematic ways, through colonialism and exploitation. And some of these consumers in Britain were very aware of this. Some of them were unconcerned. Some of them had issues with it at the time. But all of them would be aware to some extent. And I think anyone who kind of works in science, I think we've all had this this kind of scenario where you're busy in your office doing a little bit of work, and then some guy just sort of rocks up and tries to explain things to you. So here he is doing that at Waddesdon Manor. So if women could be active in science, who do we have? So first of all, we have Maria Sibylla Merian. So she was a German entomologist, a naturalist, and a scientific illustrator. She was one of the earliest European naturalists to document observations, particularly about insects. She raised silkworms from the age of 13. She published her first book of natural illustrations at age 28, and then she just didn't stop. She went on to publish lots of books, particularly about insects and documenting their life cycles. And she also, as well as writing the books, she engraved and coloured all of her own plates, and she did all of those etchings as well. So she was a very clever lady. She was the first person to document very distinct and predictable lifestyles in insects. And this sounds quite surprising, but actually she was the person who finally disproved the idea of spontaneous generation of insects, because before that, lots of people thought that insects just kind of popped out of the soil. Born of mud, it was called. So she took on female pupils as well in art. She told her art to female art collectors. She travelled to Suriname for 2 years. She was very critical of the colonialists and their slaves, actually. And unusually for people of this time, when she was describing plants and insects, she retained the indigenous names and noted their uses to indigenous people, whereas lots of other people just kind of took them and pretended they were the first person to ever see them. And in honour of Maria Sibylla Merian, a bird-eating spider is named in her honor. So what higher honor is there than that? We also have Elizabeth Blackwell. So I love Elizabeth Blackwell. She wrote A Curious Herbal between 1737 and 1739. So her husband was not the most fabulous guy. He was her second cousin. He practiced as a physician with no medical training. He eventually got found out, and then he set up as a publisher without any training in publishing either. So he received heavy fines for that, and he ended up in prison. So she decided to write and illustrate a herbal in order to raise the funds to get him out. While she was doing that, sadly, both her children died in 1736. But she did get on with the work. She created her herbal. She finally raised enough to get her husband out of debtor's prison, whereby he pretty much immediately took up with another woman, moved to Sweden, became involved in a treasonous plot, and was hanged for his trouble. So there we are. Didn't go too well for Elizabeth Blackwell, but I think she was probably better off without him, frankly. Anyway, then we have Jeanne Barré. So she came from a poor part of Burgundy. So unlike many of the other people we're talking about, she didn't come from money. So nobody knows really how she became literate in the first instance, because women were not really educated at this time. She became a housekeeper to naturalist Philibert Commerson. He was a very wealthy man. And she had a son with him soon after she took up the position. She gave up the illegitimate child to the Foundling Hospital in Paris. And then she travelled. They were genuinely in love, it seems, and she travelled with him on a French Navy ship as her lover's servant in 1766. So nobody on the ship knew she was a woman. She disguised herself as a man, as his servant, and she lived for all of that time as a man. He was a bit of a sickly guy. He suffered from both seasickness and a recurring leg ulcer. So basically, she did lots of the work of collecting and cataloguing all of the plants. So it took until they reached Tahiti, which is probably as far as they could have got before she was exposed as a woman by the Tahitians, in fact, who were very excited to see someone from the West who wasn't male, because until that point, everyone that had rocked up on their shores had been male. So that she, through that, became the first woman ever to circumnavigate the globe in 1769. She helped collect more than 6,000 plant specimens. And on her return, she basically became a very successful businesswoman and made a significant fortune. Speaking of people with significant fortunes, Queen Charlotte, married to George III of the UK, Britain at the time. She was a keen botanist and plant collector. So she was married in 1761 to George III when she was 17. She was brought over from Germany. She didn't really speak any English, but it seemed to be a happy marriage. Produced 15 children, 13 of whom survived to adulthood. She loved plants and gardens. She was very friendly with botanists of the time. She also expanded Kew Gardens, and she sort of accidentally introduced the Christmas tree to Britain by decorating a sprig of yew. And then that just basically got out of hand. Then we have Priscilla Bell Wakefield. So she was an English Quaker, philanthropist, and author. Promoted lots of social projects for women, like maternity hospitals, schools. She wrote about feminist economics and scientific subjects, and ended up publishing about 24 books, including an introduction to botany in 1796. So it was often men were writing a lot of very inaccessible books in science, and it was often women who kind of translated them into the popular culture. And she was the first one who did that for botany. She also wrote scientific books for children. Helena Pepenti, a scientist, inventor, and botanist from Italy. She developed a vaccine against smallpox and tested it on herself and her family, as you do. So she had 15 children in 21 years. So apparently had to slow down a little bit, but she still managed during that time to develop a way to spin asbestos into lace, into fireproof fabrics, and fireproof ink that won paper that won her gold and silver medals from the National Institute of Milan, and also attracted the attention of Napoleon. So very impressive. And finally, Marianne North, who was sort of came slightly after Anne, but she was a botanical artist who traveled the globe. She very much shunned ideas that women shouldn't travel alone. And after her father died when she was age 40, she visited 15 countries in 14 years, including Japan, Brazil, Sicily, Canada, the US, Jamaica, South America, India, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Java. So while she was there, she painted the people, plants, and places that she saw. She was very obsessed by plants. She collected many plants that were new to botanical science, including the Nepenthes northiana that you can see there, a very exciting pitcher plant from Borneo, which was named after her, Marianne North. It's the Nepenthes northiana. And on her return, she wanted the paintings to be available to everyone who couldn't afford to travel, so that they could see what it was like in other areas around the world. So she donated 800 paintings to the botanical gardens at Kew. And she also funded a gallery to be opened there, and it's still there to this day with all her paintings in it. So if you're ever around London, please do go there. So despite all of this, and despite all of the amazing women who we have, the first woman was not elected to the Royal Society in Britain until 1946, which is kind of wild, isn't it? But two ladies who I do particularly want to draw your attention to, who I think would have had quite a lot of common with Anne. One is Margaret Cavendish Bentinck. So she was the Duchess of Portland, the first Duchess of Portland. She was a very determined lady, like Anne Lister, but she took a very different route to that. So she was interested in science, and she decided to collect the world. She was one of the country's richest ladies. She married the Duke of Portland, and basically just spent all of her money and all of his money on cool plants, scientific objects, basically fueling her cabinet of curiosity. She came from a learned family, and she later became a member of the Blue Stockings. And at this time, the Blue Stockings was, it was very new. They were a learned society of ladies who got together. They were very bored of the general evenings that they had with their men, who gambled a lot and drank a lot. So at the Blue Stocking meetings, they talked about art, and they talked about literature, and they talked about theatre. And they had speakers come in, and they drank tea and coffee, and they did not gamble. So, but by the time Anne Lister came to reference the Blue Stockings and didn't want to be seen as one, it had kind of run its course and was seen as being a little bit frivolous. But at this point, it was a great thing. So, so the Duchess's collection, when she had built up her collection of scientific objects, it was second only in size to the British Museum in the UK. And on her death, it took 9 months to catalogue her collection, and it took 36 days to sell in a huge and very popular auction. So she wasn't alone in her endeavours either. So her partner in crime in this was Mary Delany, partner in crime and partner in other things as well, potentially. Mary Delany was an artist, a lady of letters, and a socialite. She had a very challenging history. So she was married twice. First when she was 17, she was married off to a friend of the family who was 61 in hope that they could save the family's fortune. But he died without remembering to include her in his will, which was unfortunate. So then she got married again. But she got married again to a gentleman in Ireland who also seemed to have a predilection for men himself. And she seems to have had a number of queer relationships in her time. But the longest one was with the Duchess of Portland, who we just talked about earlier. So on the death of both of their husbands, who both died quite early, Mary Delany moved in with the Duchess, and they spent 20 years collecting, botanizing, and generally making mischief together, as far as I can tell. Mary Delany made the Duchess a grotto from shells because she thought she'd like it, which she did. And as the Duchess collected plants from around the globe and brought them into her garden and built up her estate and had a glass house with all of these amazing plants in it, Mary Delany recorded them in a herbarium created from cut paper. So as you can see here, so the one on the left is a physalis. You might have seen those Chinese lanterns. So this is all made out of cut paper. And she started this when she was 71. And people always say that she started doing the paper cuts when her eyesight started to fail and she stopped painting. But if your eyesight's starting to fail, swapping a paintbrush for a knife or scissors seems like a bad plan to me. So who knows? But she created these incredible records of the Duchess's garden, basically, and people like Joseph Banks and even the King and Queen sent plants to her to be recorded in this way. So and you'll notice that she put all of the botanical names on them in the manner of Linnaeus, and this is her little moniker, Mary Delany, in the corner. So I frankly, I'm just generally astonished by the two of them, and I hope that it kind of shows that Anne Lister here was really sitting on the shoulders of some fairly incredible women. They weren't really supposed to be doing this. The general not feeling of the time, but the general established view from men is that women's brains were smaller than men's. They weren't really cut out for this kind of thing. If they did this kind of thing, it could have all sorts of unfortunate side effects in women if they engaged too much in scientific or learned thought. And basically women were kept in their place by being kept uneducated. But like Anne Lister, lots of people just kind of ignored that and did it anyway. It was much easier to do if you were quite rich. Anyway, on to Lynn, and what's it all got to do with Anne Lister? We can't hear you, Lynn. I think you're on mute.
Brilliant. Good start. Thank you. So this has all got quite a lot to do with Anne Lister. Botany was one of Anne's many scientific interests, and there are many mentions in Anne's journals of botany, gardens, and landscaping. Through her own efforts, really, she was highly educated. In addition to going to school, she had private lessons, read widely and taught herself, and attended occasional lectures in Halifax. She had many academic interests: languages, maths, music, theology, and so on. But chief amongst these interests really was sciences. One interest that perhaps dates Anne today is her interest in phrenology, the study of the shape and size of the cranium of a person to supposedly establish their mental abilities and character. With her friend, Miss Frances Pickford, she corresponded in 1830 about phrenology. And in fact, Miss Pickford sent her a bust, perhaps like this one, from Switzerland, I think, in 1830. But back to botany. So for us non-botanists, a bit of a recap. Botany is the study of the structure and genetics of a plant and how it works, where it grows, and how it connects with its environment. For 4 years, Anne was studying sciences in Paris. Why Paris? She knew it quite well. She'd been several times by 1827. It was affordable to live there for months at a time, and lectures were more accessible to women. In Paris, she attended lectures in a range of sciences, including geology, zoology, anatomy, and so on. And she also attended lectures in botany and plant physiology. On this map, you can see that Anne saw gardens the length and breadth of Britain and Ireland, really, over the years. And one particular, or a couple of particular gardens of interest to Anne were Llangollen, where she had badly wanted to go for some time. This, of course, was the home of the ladies of Llangollen, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby. These ladies were famous even at the time and received distinguished visitors. And even then, there was speculation about the nature of their relationship. Anne had read about the place in 1810 and finally visited in 1822. In her words, she had longed to see the place for the last dozen years. Basically, she invited herself to see the grounds. And the house and garden struck Anne as very pretty, and she talked to the gardener there for a good deal. She mentions her visit a number of times in the journal. It excited in me a sort of interest tinged with melancholy. And there is something in their story that makes a deep impression. She wanted badly to go back there with Mariana. And this all suggests an affinity with the ladies and perhaps a longing for the lifestyle that they had. Another notable garden visit is when she went to Chatsworth with Anne Walker in 1835. And on the left there, you can see Chatsworth pretty much as she would have known it then, and actually very similar today. There, Anne requested a meeting with Joseph Paxton, who was working there. I think he'd been working there about 10 years by that point. And he was to become the greatest plantsman and architect of the Victorian era. At the time Anne visited, he was preparing plans for this conservatory. And you can see this huge size of it by the people standing at the bottom and even halfway up. Anne was not shy to give her opinion on his costings for the project, but sadly she never saw this conservatory as it was completed in 1840. This slide here shows a number of countries across Europe in which Anne visited gardens and wrote about them. Most notably, in Paris, she went to many gardens and visited and mentioned them numerous times for 20 years, perhaps from 1819. And between 1827 and 1839, she visited gardens in these other countries, and no doubt perhaps some others. She was even knowledgeable about wildflowers that she spotted when walking in the gardens of, in the mountains of Chamonix in 1834. And moving on from the gardens that Anne visited to landscaping efforts, Anne had big ambitions for Shibden and for the wider estate. And from the mid-1820s and into the 1830s, she was reading books, magazines, periodicals, and the like on horticulture and botany. Typically for Anne, the books reveal a wide range of particular interests. For instance, in medicinal botany, the vegetables of Britain, and landscape gardening. The accounts books also reveal quite a close interest in what was going on in the garden and the landscape. For the vegetable garden, she selected and bought peas, onions, turnip seed and cauliflower plants. And for the estate, she bought oaks, hollies, fir trees, and other trees and shrubs, and even did some of the work herself. I had come in very much heated with pulling down the garden wall, as you do. That was in 1836. And in 1837, she wrote, "My eye that got lashed in planting the thorns yesterday is very painful." After moving in aristocratic circles and also touring Europe, Anne knew that Shibden was quite cramped and old-fashioned. In the 1830s, she had a huge amount of work done on the hall and the outbuildings. She reworked the stables and the coach house and created the carriage drive, lodge, and gate. That was the hardscaping. For the softer landscaping and gardens in the estate, she employed the landscape gardener, landscape designer Samuel Gray. Her aim was to create an elegant landscape from land which was previously used for farming and coal extraction. So she created, as we know today, the terrace and the turret shown in the picture. The mere was created, and part of the purpose of that was to give the impression of a river flowing through the estate. She created a flower garden and an avenue of trees along the terrace. These works were done to both upgrade Shibden, but also how Anne could present herself. In light of this, in the late 1830s, she planned a hothouse and ordered a melon frame. This melon frame and the hothouse further showcase Anne's social aspirations. After the pineapple was brought to Europe in the 17th century, it became fashionable for the wealthy to grow exotic fruits, such as the melon. Exotic fruits need consistent heat and humidity to grow. And in the 1830s, you needed a hothouse for this. This was expensive to build with the glass and the pipes. And to run, you needed coal to heat it. So only the wealthy could do that. It was quite a status symbol and a display of your position in society. And quite probably that was something that Anne was aiming for.
Thank you, Lynn. It's fascinating, isn't it? And it's amazing what we can find from the archives. And I'm sure there's plenty more out there as well that we've still got to go. So it's really exciting to sort of understand how, if we can start to understand more about how Anne built up the estate over the time. And it's such a shame that she didn't get to build her hothouse, and so we could see how she might have moved into the world of growing those exotics, because I'm sure it was things that she'd seen in other gardens on her travels. So basically, I think, you know, she was doing amazing things in all of her life, but that included botany and it included her garden. And she really was working at a time and some very determined women broke through in both science and publishing. And she was obviously one of these people who was determined to make a difference. And we know that women have contributed more to science and botany than is recorded. And we know that they have, you know, built more estates than we would know about. But if it wasn't for Anne's diaries, we wouldn't know really about her contributions to the Shibden estate. And I think there's so much that we don't know about women's contribution to these estates in the past. So, for example, I mean, Sarah Paxton, who was Joseph Paxton's wife, Joseph Paxton, who built the amazing conservatory that Lynn showed you there at Chatsworth. He was the first person to build a conservatory. He was so big, but actually he kind of planned it, and then he sort of jaunted off around the country. So his wife had to kind of supervise most of the building, and also supervise most of the gardens while he was away. So really, you know, women are doing a lot here, and Anne was in on that, running her own estate at the time. And I think she spent quite a lot of time with Sarah Paxton, so I think they must have had quite a lot to chat about. But clearly, and what Lynn's amazing research has shown is that gardens and botany really did help to shape Anne's own identity as a woman of the world and as a mover in higher society. Some people would have disliked this intensely because, you know, women weren't really supposed to be doing this. Some would be really impressed. And I'm sure that it made for very interesting conversations over dinner. She didn't want to be known as a blue stocking, but she did want to be known as a learned lady. And I think if we know anything about Anne Lister, that if she was interested, she would do what she wanted anyway. So thank you very much. And I'm now going to switch over to the other document and see if you have any questions. Right. Give me a second. Lynn, you might get there before me, I don't know.
Right, shall I make a start with one?
Yes, good idea.
Would Anne have been aware of any of these female botanists? I don't know, but I think that's a really good question. And you would imagine that she would be. And I've just made a note of that to actually do some research on the all these names that Sue told us about. So interestingly, I'll be going through the Anne Lister's people and books spreadsheet. Not the people, but the books. And I think that's a good question. I don't know. The answer is the honest answer.
No, and I think the fact that we don't know the answer is quite significant, actually, because you would have thought that if she would have known more about these women, she might have noted it down if she'd have seen things, but there's not really any reason that you would see them. I think because gardens are kind of quite ephemeral, and because most of the records and most of the glory went to the men involved, she probably wouldn't have been aware of the kind of the magnitude of some women's contribution to this. And I think it's very noticeable that women were kind of kept ignorant of other women's learning, but also of other women's contributions to some extent. I think if you were in the higher echelons of society and you were rich enough to be part of the Blue Stockings group, then brilliant, and you were doing that thing, but actually probably that legacy would not have transferred down. And lots of women were doing it kind of under the radar. So Jeannie Barret, who just scooted around the globe dressed as a man, was just trying to do it undercover because she liked it. So yeah, it's very interesting. Right, more questions. Did any of these women attend lectures like Anne Lister? Yes, they absolutely did. So there were very serious scientific lectures that were meant mostly for men, but sometimes we know that women did disguise themselves as men and go into these lectures. So things like anatomy and things where they weren't supposed to really be involved. Lots of things like, but then were lots of very popular lectures. So lectures became kind of more popular and more spectacular, I suppose. And people who were running lectures like this, if they were for monetizing and they were popular, it's like, I guess, like theatre and events now, they did it for the entertainment value. So for example, when electricity came on the scene, there was lots of kind of electricity generating machines, and you would kind of attach a very pretty lady to the electricity generating machine. And then there was a very famous experiment where the members of the audience were invited to give a kiss to this lady, and they would receive an electric shock through her lips. So and lots of things where they kind of like suspended children from the ceiling and electrified them, and then got paper to stick to them through static and all of those kind of things. So yes, lots of women did go to lectures. Do we know which parts of the Shibden grounds are areas that she planted, such as any of those large trees? That's a great question. Lynn, do we? I don't.
I do know that she had a lot to do with the Canary Woods, and that at the time I found the Woodland Trust has got a piece on the Canary Woods, how it used to be the kitchen garden, which is not quite answering the question, but of course there are loads of trees there now. I don't know, I'm going to be saying a lot of don't knows here. I don't know the particular areas that she planted or which trees. I know that there's a kind of orchard area to the west of the terrace, which came later than Anne.
Great, thank you. Did Anne Walker provide any insight or opinions about the Shibden gardens or landscaping? That's a great question as well.
That's
I don't
another
know.
really good question, isn't it? To which I'm
We'd
also
love to
going.
find out there, wouldn't we?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there is plenty of scope for finding out. I do know that at one point they were a bit back and forth to Lydgate, because they were going over there to do a little bit of planting, and wanted to recommend plants over there. But
Yeah.
yes, another fascinating question. I know that Mariana gave Anne some of her opinion, really, when Anne wanted to make Shibden more fancy and put some castle-y bits on the top, and call it Shibden Castle. And Mariana gave her opinion on that. But as to Anne Walker in the Shibden Gardens and landscaping, another really good question, and I'm not sure.
So I think we've got a few questions about kind of the building of the cascade and the glen and fountains, and whether there were any plants that she mentions in her travels that she brought back or decided to grow at Shibden later. And I think for me, that's kind of not an area that we're quite into yet, or we've got quite the insight into. But Kay's put in the chat that in the 1834 travel journals, she visits lots of nurseries in order to find plants that were sent back. So kind of matching that up to any kind of accounts of the estate would be lovely. Whether it's possible from the records we have, I don't know. But if we can do that in the future, I think that would be brilliant. But trying to match the two between would be a challenge, but great, I think.
And the travel books and the accounts books would be potentially interesting, as well as the diaries there.
Yes, absolutely. That would be very interesting. What you usually find in that you that you know about plants is that they basically bought an awful lot of things for the kitchen garden. So you find all of the accounts of kind of peas and lettuce and radishes and sprouts and all of those things, and then sort of dotted within them you find some curious plants. But I think what we might find is that Anne was kind of busy on the estate and kind of getting the hard landscaping sorted, for want of a better term. So remodeling the estate, building the mere, building the cascade, building all of those areas and improving the whole, and was sort of getting to the point where she was going to invest in a hothouse for melons and a place to grow more curious plants that might embed her status as being a bit more accomplished in this area, but sadly never quite got there. Ooh, I wonder if Anne knew of the concept of non-native invasive species. Absolutely not. I wouldn't have thought. That's a great question, though. But no, I think at that time we were still just bringing everything back. We thought that rhododendrons and camellias needed to be in a glass house, so everyone stuck those in there all the time. And of course, then rhododendron ponticum just turns out that it grows everywhere in the UK, has just grown under every forest. And now we're in the process of trying to take it out because it spreads all sorts of diseases. So there were a lot of things that were just sort of let loose.
Yeah, the Victorians brought loads back, didn't they? I mean, they did some incredible things, many incredible things, but they brought back animals and plants which are sort of horrifically invasive today. So, you know, some of the things that they did were not so smart.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, people didn't know, they just kind of brought things back. And people, as well as plants, people were bringing back, like you say, Lynn, animals. They kept them in menageries. Some of them escaped. That's why we have such a colourful flora and fauna, I guess, in the UK now, for better or for worse. But did Anne mostly note ornamental plants, or does she mention fruiting and edible plants? She mentions the melons, which is great. So she would have been planning to grow melons, which would have been amazing. Anything else, Lynn, on that?
I was really interested, actually, that she took such close attention to what seemed quite mundane today. So, like buying cauliflower plants and turnip seeds and onions. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know of any mention as of, like, we today, I mean, especially nowadays, our house plants are extremely popular and fashionable, and I don't recall mention, although there's loads of diary that I haven't read yet, of like ornamental plants for the house.
Absolutely. And that's a whole new world that I think we could delve into. I think we're just coming to the end now. We've got 2 minutes. One new message, but thank you, Alice, for the Instagram plug on the chat. And I hope you've all really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I think I have to say to Lynn, who is obviously fabulous, and also to the Unlisted Research Summit team, who have created just the most seamless experience here, which has been brilliant. So thank you for all your comments and everything.
Well, from me, thank you, Sue, for being so willing to join. I really wanted to ask you, and I've loved your enthusiasm, and thank you for being so encouraging. That's been great. And as you say, the Research Summit team is extremely organised and completely fluid and pretty impressive. So thank you to you and to them.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. It's been brilliant. Thank you for coming. Had a lovely time.